We have only half an hour and we have two absolutely brilliant speakers. I think many of us have heard Dinesh Trivedi, especially in the exciting times that he lived through when he was railway minister and soon thereafter. And Meera, of course, is very well known, both for her work that she did in the United States and that she has done before and since. I propose that what we do is ask Meera to speak first and take up to 10 minutes. And perhaps, Mr. Trivedi, sir, you could take around 10 minutes, a little more, and leave maybe 5 minutes, 7 minutes for discussion, because that will take a whole half an hour. I just have a couple of comments to make, because the topic is, can we integrate the two Indias? Now, first of all, this question of two Indias is something that goes back a little while ago, when people kept talking about India and Bharat, as if they were two entirely different things. For many of us, we come from what they call Bharat, which is small town India, which is village India, and we ended up in the big town. One of the best people, one examples I can give you of that is Prakash Tandon, who wrote the Punjabi Century and books subsequent to that. Prakash Tandon lived in rural Punjab, ended up as chairman of the most major multinational company in India in those years, and did a great job, became a management guru in the country, chairman of IIM Ahmedabad and so on. So I don't know if there is a contrast, and I don't know what kind of integration we're talking about, but perhaps our two distinguished speakers will touch on that. Then when we talk about two Indias, what are we talking about? Urban, rural, but then rural India is becoming rapidly urban. And when I started my life as a management trainee in Hindustan Lever in 1957, went into rural India, it was a very, very different kind of life than what I was used to living in Bombay and Delhi. When I travel now, there is not all that much difference. Many companies are now making vast sums of money aiming at rural markets. And they're doing that because life has changed for many. But again, there are very many for whom it has not changed. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about gender, male, female, and the treatment we give to males and females in India? And in any kind of income class, in any kind of society in India? Are we talking about health services? Are we talking about education? In each of these, there are differences, and very, very, very major differences. And we need to look at, how do we integrate this? That's my opening remarks, and I would now leave it to Meera.
Thank you, Professor Rao. You've raised, questions about the question posed in the topic which we are supposed to address. I would say that there is only one India, and that this India is experienced differently by different people based on their multiple identities as Indians, as people coming from a particular region, based on their linguistic identity, their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, their profession, and of course, their social and economic status. India's strength has always been its acceptance of diversity, and that is an essential characteristic of India. We have been able to assimilate influences from heterogeneous sources and to synthesize them into something new, which we could call Indian. If America is sometimes described as the melting pot in the heat of which you lose your identity to become an Indian, to become an American, then I suppose India could rightly be described as a bowl of fruit chaat with different ingredients sitting side by side to make up that spicy whole. To further cloud or muddy the waters, we have Christopher Columbus, who stumbled upon America while looking for India. And as a result, there are whole groups of indigenous populations across North and South America who are called Indians. And so you have this situation today where you have American Indians, who earlier used to be called Red Indians or Native Americans, and now you have the Indian Americans or Americans of Indian origin who came from India. But of course, to speak more seriously, I think what the question seeks to address is whether India's economic development will remain restricted to 30% of the people or so who are now categorized as being in the middle class, be it lower, middle, or upper middle class, or whether it will embrace also the 70% of the people who remain at the bottom of the pyramid. I believe that India has no option but to strive to ensure that the expansion of the Indian economy doesn't remain limited only to a few, but expands to encompass the bulk of its population. This is not just a matter of ethics or ethical values, it is also a question of hard economics. Because if your marketplace remains restricted to the variously described 300 million people, 400 million people who are in the middle class, you will not be able to leverage the benefits or the advantages of India's size and population for optimum economic expansion. Therefore, as a country, we would need to seek a development process which enables us to optimize our economic growth. Now, what do we need to achieve this objective? And is it achievable? I think I am an optimist, and I do believe that we should be able to achieve this over the next 2 decades or so, if we are able to sustain a high rate of growth. I do think that we can return to and sustain a high rate of growth, and that we in India tend to swing too vigorously between different moods. So just as the earlier euphoria about India becoming an economic superpower was exaggerated, and perhaps without any basis, the deep pessimism that I now encounter today about the prospects of the Indian economy are perhaps also unreasonable and excessive. Now, what do we need to do to ensure that we can have this high rate of economic growth? I think we do have fundamentals in the economy which will be our strength in the long run, including a youthful population which will provide the kind of energy and dynamism to economic growth in India. We also have an ease with democracy and debate, which will be strengths as we move forward in terms of sustaining consensus on the way forward. And at the same time, we have a well-educated and entrepreneurial people who will be able to provide the kind of momentum to the economy that we seek. But at the same time, I think what will be very important is building a political consensus, even though in a democracy, I think political contestation is an intrinsic part of it. At the same time, as a society, we need to build a strong social and political consensus on the broad contours of the policies we need to follow for the way forward. Among these would be to invest in infrastructure, because without infrastructure, you will constantly be hobbled in achieving your potential. We've made some progress in some sectors such as telecom. Others are still lagging behind, and this needs concentrated focus by the government. So also do sectors such as education and health and skill development, because without emphasis on developing the productive capacities of your people, they will not be able to participate in and benefit from the expansion of the Indian economy. Now, as Mr. Raghavan said, it doesn't mean that India will become a developed country living at standards equivalent to those in the US or Europe, because even though we may have a huge expansion in GDP, given the numbers involved, per capita incomes are still going to be relatively low. And therefore, I think what India could aspire to is to become a middle-income country. At the moment, we are one of the lesser developed countries in terms of per capita income. We could aspire to become a middle-income country in the long run, but given the overall size of our economy, we will exercise enormous influence and weight in the global economy, even if our overall levels of income remain low. If we look forward, we see, as Mr. Rao mentioned, that the rural-urban divide is also disappearing. I see across India the same aspirations, particularly young India, the same aspirations to become either a Shah Rukh Khan or a Sachin Tendulkar or even an Anand Mahindra. We see this in the young people who have won medals in the recent Olympics. They have come from small town India. They have the energy, they have the confidence, they have the determination, and they have the will to succeed. The question is, will we in India, as a state and a society, enable them to pursue their dreams and to find fulfillment? Thank you.
Thank you, Meera. I think Meera made a very fundamental point when she pointed out to us that a very large part of the Indian population lives in gross inequality compared to around 30% that lives a very much better kind of life. And relating that to what Srinivas Raghavan was saying, which is that we cannot in the foreseeable future hope for most of India to live the kinds of standards of living that are common to everybody in Europe, I think takes us to the point that was made in, one of the points that was made in the film that Harry showed us, which is to do with the nature of development. I think it is high time that we began to think seriously in India about what is the nature of development that we should go for in India, because this kind of inequality is not sustainable in a democratic country, and we need to think about it. May I now request Mr. Trivedi to.
Namaskar, and a very good afternoon to those people who are awake. Looks like nobody is awake. It's a very tall order after the lunch break, and especially you have such a good buffet laid out, and then to be attentive. And Professor Rao has given me a much taller order for a politician to restrict to 10 minutes. Not possible, and especially these days when you hardly get chance to speak on the floor of the parliament. I just wanted this wake-up call. Thank you, Sohail, for that. Sohail is always a leader. He led in this as well. Did you notice one thing? We all have one thing in common. And you know what? That we all are former ambassador, former railway minister, So we are like that fakir on the bank of Indus, nothing to conquer, but to conquer your own self. And hopefully, Harry has called us not for our position, but perhaps for our wisdom, and we get wiser when we leave our positions. I'm not getting into any technicalities. I'm not even getting into what is the growth rate, what kind of food we consume. I'm just getting into two Indias. One India which lives with somewhat dignity, somewhat like human beings. That India which has got opportunity. That India which talks, which speaks, which influences policies, and that India who can afford to come to these 5 stars. That is one India. And the other India, which was 83%, today which is 70%. And that 70%, and I can tell you with all the responsibility under my command, that 70% India has everything perhaps in the sense the life can offer, nature can offer. When I said everything, they have sunlight, they have oxygen, but they do not have the basic amenities to live. They have no dignity a human being must have to be called a human being. So I'm not even talking about a developed country, a superpower. Let's understand what is rural. The villages where 70% of India lives. And how do we define a village? A village, as per the census is defined, is a population of 5,000 villagers, 400 people per square kilometer, and 75% of the male in that particular area are not directly or indirectly involved with agriculture occupation. If that be the case, then it is not a village. A village is that where people, 5,000 I just mentioned, are involved in agriculture. And let's also understand that we have directly or indirectly, India lives in villages. So when we talk about India and we talk about villages, certainly, like Ashok mentioned yesterday, we cannot forget Gandhiji. And that is the India which we are talking about. That India, unfortunately, has no taste of independence or freedom. And that is the India where, as per the World Bank, 70% of the people, 75% of the people who earns less than 1.25 US dollars per day is 41.6%. And people who earn less than $2 a day is 75.6%. And that is the India perhaps we are talking about. We have people in rural India, those who live below poverty level, are 221 million. And in urban it is 81 million. This is as per our planning commission. If we go as per the World Bank, then it is almost 75% of that India, whether they are living in villages or they are living in the city. Slumdog millionaire is the same life they live, which is without dignity. I think we are talking about that India. And that India, certainly, given the opportunity. What is the difference between this India, called India Incorporated, called the cities, and that India called villages. What is the difference? The difference is very simple. Opportunity. Meera just mentioned that given the opportunity, you look at the cricket team of today. They can't speak English. And this is another divide. The divide is the language. If you can't speak English, then you don't come from that India, which is dreaming of becoming a superpower. So cricketers are there, but they are afraid to go to a media, because that's there where they have to speak English. And that reminds me of incidents which Kapil Dev always narrates, that he had gone to Australia. And for the first time, and Kapil Dev also, we all come from villages, please understand. And Kapil Dev, when he was sitting in the taxi, and Dennis Lilly was a deadly bowler. So the cabbie asked, "Have you come here to die?" Kapil Dev got a little upset. He said, "No, I have not come here to die. I have come here to kill you guys." So taxiwala he said, "What has happened?" Then he was explained that the Australian accent of today is to die. So he said, "We have not come here to die, but we have come here." Now this is the difference. And that is what is what is your conception? How do you conceptualize a situation? It's like that Texan who goes to an Indian village and he wanted to know how big is the farm. Texas, they have, thousands of acres. So he goes to Haryana with his ADC and says that, "Show me the biggest farm." So he goes to one of the Chaudhary, and the interpreter says that, "Chaudhary ji, इसको आपके बारे खेत के बारे में बताइए कि कितना बड़ा है आपका खेत." तो चौधरी जी कहते हैं कि देखो भैया, वो देखते हो सामने एक बहुत बड़ा पेड़ दिखता है बहुत दूर, वो एक सिरा है, that is one end of my farm, and you see the other end where you see a long far off a bridge like thing structure, that is the other end of my farm, and very proudly that I have a very big farm. And then he says to Texan, "Arey, ye to bata, tera farm kitna bada hai?" So the Texan says that, "How do I explain this Indian, how big is my farm? Very difficult job." So he said that, "Okay, I have a car. And I start in the morning from one end of my farm, and I go to the other end of my farm. It will take the whole day for me to reach from one end to another end in that car." You know what Chaudhary Sahab said? कि हाँ, मेरे पास भी ऐसी गड्डी थी, हमने फेंक दी. So how do you perceive this? And that is where I personally feel that the condition of the farmers, I won't say it's remained the same. It has worsened. If you take the real income, if you take last 10 years, his wheat production has gone up by 52% or more. But in real terms, his income has gone down. How do you expect him to survive? And we talk about superpower. I personally feel, unless and until we understand what real India is all about, we cannot be apprehending a situation of a villager. If you talk about habits, very honestly, we all have the village habits, and we are very proud of it. I can guarantee you, sir, if khichdi is given here, and you are told, "Ke bhai, eat the way you want to eat," I think 99.9% will use their fingers. And they would love to eat that way, and there's nothing wrong in it. I find in five-star hotels, which I don't find anywhere else, I only find in India, health faucet. is given there. We have toilet papers also. We have got health facet also. And you understand why. You just had lunch, so I don't want to get into those details. But the fact is, that's what we are. And that value has seen India quite far off. And before I start getting signals from the moderator, I better stop here. But I can tell you in conclusion, unless and until the Planning Commission understand that India, you will not be spending that 70% of your GDP in that India. I go in for my elections. What do they ask for? Sadak, pani, and of course, Harry Saab, bijli. That is the only thing they require, and it's about time that Planning Commission gets into the basics. They don't even have potable drinking water. So that is the India we are talking about. Unless and until that India merges with this India, I'm afraid we can only go backward, not forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trivedi. As always, you made a very, very fundamental point. It's interesting that both the ambassador and Mr. Trivedi are going in the same direction. The focus is on the enormous inequalities of India and the need to reduce those inequalities. And I suggest that perhaps we do need to think seriously about the kind of development we should have if we're going to bring those inequalities down. We have plenty of time for discussion. I suggest we have about 3 or 4 comments from the floor and then leave it to the speakers to respond. Just introduce yourself, please, when you... Anybody?
Yeah. Hello.
Sorry, I can't see, so you just, yes, please.
Good afternoon, Professor Gopal Saxena here from BSES. You know, one of the issues that both these very distinguished people have raised is this issue of inequality across various spectrums of life in India. If one looks at the development of some of these countries, which includes Japan, Korea, and the US also, for that matter, a large part of the social equity has come through development of the agriculture sector and the raising of farm prices. I mean, we've been looking at it from 1950s onward as part of our planning process. But somehow we've never been able to inculcate this into our planning. And I think Mr. Trivedi rightly pointed this out also. But the fact of the matter is that unless we start doing this and raising the incomes of the agricultural sector, this kind of socially inclusive growth is just not going to happen.
Thank you.
That was a...
Anybody else? Please.
I have a little note of dissent. The entire focus in this session has been on the economic aspect. I spent my young days in a village and last 32 years in Chandigarh, a modern city. The position which was brought out in the last session about Punjab can apply to Haryana also. And some of the rich in rural areas can be richer than rich in urban areas. And the poor in urban areas can be poorer than the poor in rural areas. The difference lies not so much in economic aspect. Economically, villages of Punjab and Haryana have moved forward and rest of the country will follow suit in its own time. The difference is sociological. The sociological aspect of our cities and that of the villages totally differs. Our cities will sooner or later become as good or bad as cities in the West. But our villages will remain different because perhaps there are no such villages anywhere in the world. Maybe in South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but in Europe and America, you don't have villages in our sense of the word. And the sociological divide between the town, city, and the village, it's widening. While the sociological aspects are getting entrenched deeper in the villages, they are coming to the surface and disappearing in the cities. And that divide also needs to be addressed to in addition to the economic aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more of us. One more question.
Between the two presentations made, Mr. Raghavan and this panel, my question is in terms of electricity and security. If you're looking at the kind of numbers that are being talked about unemployment, about the haves and have-nots not having access. The last remark made by Mr. Raghavan was that perhaps we need to relook at the model that we're looking for development. I just wanted this reaction from the panel on how they see the two Indias integrating. Do we see rural India becoming more and more urban and therefore thereby improving or getting out of the poverty mess? Or how do you see it going forward? To you, Trivedi Saab, and then perhaps Meera can respond to that.
No, I think, this is what I started with. We have to go back to Gandhinian model. And Gandhinian model mentioned village as an independent unit. And unless and until you have an independent unit in the village cannot prosper. And if villages don't prosper, India will not prosper. So you must have health, you must have education, and in short, what is the difference between America, Europe, and India? They also have villages. It's not that they don't have villages. The amenities in America is perhaps almost the same. There is no compromise as far as the quality of life is concerned. Unfortunately, our communication, transportation, financial services have grown as far as the addition in the economy's GDP is concerned. But what has not added in terms of capacity is electricity, gas, and water supply. These are the basics. And unless and until you have these basics, I mean, we have a tremendous gap as far as energy is concerned. I mean, it is almost frightening that how are we going to do it? So answer is again the same. The villages have to be made economically absolutely independent.
I think,
Quick follow-up. Then how do you expect the villagers to pay for electricity and the other services? How does that start? How do you kickstart that?
It's very simple. What I personally feel, instead of this subsidy business, you make sure that the guy can afford it. And he can only afford it if there is a meaningful activity. Make sure his agriculture produce gets enough. Because at the moment, believe me, the kind of input he has, and India has one of the best farmers in the world, he is just not getting a fair share for his remuneration.
here, I think there are certain structural problems also in Indian agriculture, because the number of people dependent on agriculture has been expanding without the total quantum of land available expanding. So you have the same land holding now supporting that many more people, it becomes economically unviable. So what you have to do in the rural areas is to provide the kind of infrastructure that Mr. Trivedi was talking of, electricity to every village. Well, you're doing that under the Rajiv Gandhi Vidyutikaran Yojana, but it hasn't been extended to every household. It's just the line has been taken to the village. B, there's no certainty of supply because we keep promising subsidies and free electricity. The consequence of that is that there is no electricity or no assured electricity. Now, if we can look at some of the models which seem to have worked, for instance, in Gujarat, where they have segregated the electricity that they have provided to the rural areas and the electricity that they have provided for irrigation and for households. The net result is that they have been able to handle this issue a little better, but we also need to look at technology. So local generation and distribution networks using renewables, particularly for remote areas, would be very, very important. The second is, can we develop the kind of transport linkages or other linkages which will link the rural and urban economies? You know, with land becoming expensive, you'll see in the rural areas near metropolitan cities, many of the call centers have shifted there, because if they can get people with less wages, if they can get land cheaper, but provided there is infrastructure, it is possible to have other activities, economic activities in the rural areas, which will build the backward and forward linkages between the rural economy and the urban economy. But looking ahead, I think employment generation overall in India will be a challenge, and there will be migration from rural India to urban India. Now, most countries have found that urbanization becomes one of the important tools for poverty alleviation, because people are, even if they live worse, because they are, may not have accommodation and so on, but they are able always to find productive employment in the cities. So expansion of urban India is also going to be a phenomenon which we should plan for. And I think a focus on improving our competitiveness in manufacturing will be crucial. Today, we don't have, a substantive segment of our economy coming from manufacturing or industry, and the industries where we are successful are not employment generating. They're all technology intensive, so you can do away with labor. There are other consequences which flow from this, because you won't have an expansion in employment generating industries unless you also look at labor flexibilities. There are rigidities in our policies which prevent our garment exporters, for instance, or our leather exporters from being productive. But I think it's not beyond us to fashion a consensus on moving ahead, because even for workers, actually, the labor rigidities are leading to a situation where companies get around it by using contract labor, which has absolutely no security and no benefits in terms of medical leave and so on. So I think that it should be possible through a mix of policies to improve productivity and diversify economic activity in the rural areas, even as we simultaneously have to try for an orderly migration from rural India to urban India.
I just would like to quickly add that I have little difference of approach here. There has to be a balance of manufacturing and cultivation. Please understand, the entire world is decreasing as far as their agriculture activity is concerned. And there are countries who are buying, like in Middle East, land just to cultivate. Our core strength in India is still agriculture. And I am not very certain whether we want to change that core from agriculture and get everybody to get into our cities. Because the condition of a rural area really improves if you just give them connectivity. We talked about Gujarat. Gujarat, rural areas are better because they have good roads. If everybody comes to the city as it is, the condition of the city is, we do not know whether the garbage is in the city or the city is in the garbage.
In closing, may I just make 3 points? Harry, as far as your question is concerned, I think the whole morning gave a very, very clear answer as to what we should have done as far as rural electrification is concerned. We should have gone into distributed power in a big way. We can still do it. The 90% subsidy that Subbu mentioned should be going into distributed power. and leave it to the panchayats to run it. Second, the question about society, sociology, and economics. One of the things that seems to be happening is that with rural-urban migration, the cup culture has moved from Haryana into Delhi, and we've been reading about what has been happening. The caste strength in the villages seems to have moved also into the cities. You see this also in South India. And I think something will have to be done through social movements to try and prevent that from continuing. The third thing, as far as the structure of the economy is concerned, we cannot have a continuation of our present situation for too long, where 60% of the population is dependent on agriculture, resulting in enormous poverty and huge inequalities. They will have to move out. But whether they move into the cities or we are able to get jobs like the President Abdul Kalam kept saying, Pura, getting urban facilities in rural areas, that is probably what we should be doing. And something in that direction is beginning to happen. May I thank both the panelists for these wonderful and keeping to the, more or less, the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.